right, well, good morning, welcome back. Welcome back. I wanted to thank all of you who came out to the church business meeting last week, and where we voted in the new constitution, which is now the law of the land, I guess you could say. And so now it's I can tell you what else you guys voted in. Written that constitution. So some of the other, fine print kind of things that most people maybe didn't pick up on. So in terms of the membership rules now, New York Mets fans are automatically excommunicated. That's not even.
How?
We just bypass that whole Matthew 18 thing. It's like, it's discipline. You go through all of these steps unless it's a New York Mets fan, and then out the door. That's it. Automatic expulsion from the church. And all members of the church, especially Debbie, have to agree with me. That's written in there. That's written in there, kind of thing. I didn't think that I thought somebody would point out that why is Debbie's name specifically written in the Constitution? Because she needs that kind of sort of stuff. But no, it was not. So welcome back. Today is November 19th. And it was on this date in 1620 that the Mayflower reached Cape Cod. Went on to land, and eventually there was a dinner and celebrating it. Shortly thereafter, 1644, the first Protestant missionary society was formed in New England. It's kind of interesting. It was a missionary society dedicated to evangelizing the Indians. Has anybody heard of David Brainerd? Does the name David Brainerd mean something to you? He's later, but he was a missionary to the Indians, and several early settlers were, serious about evangelizing Indians. More settlers were more interested in just getting rid of them, but there were some. Roger Williams was one who got along well with Indians, but that was in 1644. In 1798, this probably won't mean much to any of you except for Debbie. Again, today's all about things Debbie needs to pay attention to. The Dutch Rijksmuseum was founded in The Hague. Who here has been to the Rijksmuseum?
Yeah.
It moved to Amsterdam in 1808. The Rijksmuseum is basically the art museum of the Netherlands. It's where you get all Rembrandt's big Rembrandt pictures that are like as big as that wall kind of thing.
There is one at the Art Institute though, a Rembrandt. Yeah, so that's pretty cool for being in Chicago, right?
Yeah.
In 1805, Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific. The Lewis and Clark expedition. That's an interesting. I read a story about them, Stephen Ambrose story about that, the Lewis and Clark expedition. And you pick up weird things, weird useless facts. And at one point in their mission, it was the goal of the men in the mission to eat 8 pounds of meat every day. 8 pounds, and I reread that 7 times. I go, 8 pounds of meat. Kind of thing. I was like, okay, that's really weird. But in 1861, Julia Ward Howe wrote the poem "The Battle Hymn of the Republic," and at the suggestion of her clergyman, who was unnamed, suggested that she put it to the tune of the song "John Brown's Body." Has anybody heard of John Brown's? You know what the tune is? Dun dun, John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. Speaking of history, it was 80 years ago today that Lincoln delivered his Gettysburg Address. 87 years ago, 80 years ago today. So that makes it 12. I don't know. It was 80 years ago today that Lincoln delivered his Gettysburg Address. I read a book about the Gettysburg Address too. By George Will, where he talked about the battlefield at Gettysburg and how long it took them to bury all the bodies, which is one of the things you don't really think about, but it took quite a while. which is why the battle was in July and it was November here before they got to the point where they could have people, because the smell and all had been quite bad. All right, and a lighter note, in 1900, on this date, Samuel Stone died. I know, death, it's a thing today. Yes, and we all have to pay attention, it's also in the Constitution, we have to pay attention to what happened on this day. We all need to know this stuff. There's a quiz every Sunday. Samuel Stone died. Just waiting for somebody to go, oh yeah, Samuel Stone. He's an Anglican clergyman who wrote the song, "The Church's One Foundation is Jesus Christ our Lord. He is a new creation by water and the word." Two other things. In 1959, Ford pulled the plug on the Edsel. Anybody seen an Edsel? Would anybody recognize an Edsel? You know what an Edsel is? Edsel was actually Henry Ford's son. Henry Ford's son. And Edsel Ford's grandson, was Edsel Ford II, who I've met when I worked for Ford. When I say I met him, I talked with him in the deep kind of way that you talk with somebody when they look at you and say, "Is so-and-so in?" And I say, "No." So I can't say I've spoken with Edsel Ford II, but that was it. Ford pulled the plug on the Edsel. And finally, it was on this date in 1965 that Pop-Tarts were created. So I'm ending on a high point. Okay, ending on Pop-Tarts. On this date, 1965. A glorious day, no doubt, in the world of breakfast food kind of thing. There was an interesting thing about Pop-Tarts. Did you know that there are more calories in an frosted Pop-Tart than there is in a non-frosted Pop-Tart?
What?
There are more calories in a non-frosted Pop-Tart than there are in a frosted Pop-Tart.
That's weird.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, but it has something to do with there's more calories in the filling, and when you put the frosting on, they reduce the filling and the bread and all of that. So I'm not suggesting that it's healthier to eat one of those, but I'm just saying it's one of those, again, useless facts that I remember. When we were having these conversations in my class, every once in a while people will yell out, "How do you know this stuff?" And I'll say, "Because I don't forget unimportant things." So that's why I'm always worried about forgetting Debbie's birthday. That would be unimportant. Although in the new Constitution it says specifically that I am not required to remember my wife's birthday. You all are, but spouse's birthday. You all are. It's in the Constitution. Next time we go through this, I'm going to stick something in the middle just to see. I'm going to put something in there about New York Mets fans just to see, sub-point 3B. It's going to be, the trouble with doing that is I forget. Then we roll it out and get printed and sent out to everybody. And about 2 months down the road, somebody will send an email in and go, "Hey, I was just looking at this," and then I'll be, "Oops, sorry about that." Yes. So, but we should continue to be praying for the pastoral search team, for the principal search team. I know there's some big meetings coming up after Thanksgiving. We're going to be talking to some candidates, right? Yeah. So hopefully, I grew up in Bolingbrook at the Independent Baptist, what is now the Independent Baptist Church, and the longtime pastor there took over the church on Christmas Day. So that was his first Sunday in the church was Christmas Day. So it can be done. It has been done in the past, sort of thing. So we need to continue to pray for that. So let's open with prayer today before we get going. So, our Father, I'm thankful for how you've blessed us. Thank you for how you've given us strength and safety as we travel. Thank you for the chance we have to be here. Thank you for the freedom we have to study your word. And I pray your blessing on us in this time. Thank you for pastoral search team and the principal search team, for the people that are putting in so much time looking for the right person. And as we seemingly come to the end of this, I pray your continued blessing and wisdom for those who are doing discussions and interviews and questions and all of that. I pray that you would bless that whole process. Be with us in this hour, be with us in the hour to come. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're continuing in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. We'll start off, I believe, in verse 17. I'm sorry. Got my numbers wrong. 7, it should be 7. As you can tell, as you might suggest, my handouts do not go through the grammar police, so you cannot be.
Thank you for making that clear.
Yes.
We won't blame you, Debbie.
Of course.
Yeah. This should all, at the top, it should be 7, 17 through 40. In chapter 7, verses 17 through 40. And again, we've got Paul now is dealing with situations that it's kind of a reminder, the speculation of what is Paul dealing with, or what is the situation going on in Corinth. And the best guess, and this is a speculation, I mean, I think it's a reasonable speculation, but it is a speculation nonetheless, that based on either the idea that they've reached the end, that over-realized eschatology, that idea that the kingdom has come, this is it, we've achieved whatever it is we need to achieve, or this idea that the body is good and the spirit is bad, and they could be related, but it could be either or kind of thing. Based on this, that you had marriages, people that were married that were just not feeling we do not need to act the married couple anymore, and so you had husbands going their way and wives going their way. You had marriages ending because a believer was saying, well, my spouse is a non-believer, I don't need to be in this marriage anymore. And so Paul is dealing with this situation as far as how do I deal with that, okay? And when we talked about this, again, they were talking about, last week, we started chapter 7, talking about husbands and wives being mutually responsible to each other, kind of went through that, and we ended up here at the end of chapter 7:15 with this question about whether or not a believer is bound in a marriage. And the gist of it, and again, this is all it's all in the video, I think. If you're a believer, Paul is telling the church at Corinth, like, if you're a believer and your spouse is an unbeliever, that is not a reason to end the marriage. Don't. Okay, so you don't have an authorization to leave simply because you're a believer and your spouse is an unbeliever. By the same token, he says, if the unbeliever is willing to stay, you should keep in the marriage, because that's going to be a primary point of evangelization. Okay, and that they will be presented with the gospel in the way you live out your life. But then he turns around and he says, but if the unbeliever leaves, then you are not bound in the marriage. Okay, so the point here, talking about this, is like thinking, okay, what is Paul telling the church of Corinth? That in response to this situation where apparently people are becoming believers and unbelieving spouses are leaving. So he's like, okay, is that spouse, according to Paul, bound to remain the desolate, lonely divorcee for the rest of his or her life? And Paul says no. Okay. Now the reason they're leaving is because their spouse is a believer. Right. So I say that because, again, if this is not the time or the place for us to create an entire theology or approach to, what does the Bible say about divorce? At what point is the marriage over? I mean, who's bound to this or who's bound to that? But whenever you do create a theology of anything, how should you deal with this? And how, and again, we'll get into that next week when we talk about food sacrifice to idols. But this is, you take all of the different verses and say, okay, well, Paul says this here, Paul says this here, what is the comprehensive view of this? And when you do that, you have to take into account, Paul is saying right here, that if an unbelieving spouse leaves a believing spouse, then the believing spouse is not bound to the marriage. That's what Paul is saying here, okay? So it seems to me that if you're in a relationship and because of your witness, the spouse leaves, the unbelieving spouse leaves, then I think an argument could be made. Notice how I'm really couching this. An argument could be made that verse applies here. Okay, I don't think we could really look at that in 21st century U.S. and say, well, if two believers don't get along with each other and they divorce, they're not bound. It's like, well, that verse, that's not the same thing. Okay, two spouses that just aren't getting along, or irreconcilable differences or whatever. Okay, so this situation is that the non-believing spouse leaves a believing spouse, and I think the implication there is that leaving because of their faith. They don't want to live with somebody who follows that faith. Okay, that's what Paul is saying in this passage to them. Okay, moving into the same idea, beginning in verse 17, he says, "Nevertheless." Okay, any questions before I move on? If not, I explain the rest of that in the new Constitution. You can just look it up. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. So Paul is saying everyone should stay wherever you are. One way to summarize this point, this is your second thing, one way to summarize this point is to say, is to not use your Christian faith as an excuse to leave a situation. Okay, whether it is a marriage or a social situation, and we'll get to those in a second. So, becoming a believer is not grounds, say, I really want to divorce my wife. I really don't want to, I know what I'll do. I'll become a believer. I'll convert to this whole Christianity thing, and then, no. Okay. And he starts talking about it. This is the rule I laid down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Okay. Well, this clearly is something that can't be literally true. It's one of those, once done, you can't undo this. Okay. So what is Paul talking about here? And I think, this is my opinion, that he's talking about whether or not a person needs to become a Jew or not, or cease to become a Jew. All right, and this is getting into a whole other idea, and we talked about this when we went through Acts, and that is that I think Paul, and I think all of the apostles, up until like the end of Paul's life, thought of Christianity as simply the next stage of Judaism. Okay, they didn't see Christianity as a separate religion. They saw Christianity as being, oh yes. So I think Paul, to the last day of his life, considered himself a practicing Jew. What did he do every time he went into a town? He went to the synagogue. And he's just, this is my theology of how Judaism was supposed to progress, is that you become a Jew. So Paul thought he was being, however, Paul goes on to point out later in some of his other epistles that being a Jew is not a precedent's not the right word.
Guarantee.
No.
Prerequisite.
Prerequisite to being a Christian. Okay, and I think that was a development in Paul's thinking. And when he talks about being grafted in, I think that's in Romans where he talks about being grafted in. You're being grafted in above a certain point of the tree. It's like the Judaism is here, but the Gentiles are being grafted into the family. Okay, so they got into this side door into this next step of Judaism. Yes.
Well, grafting in is a foreign thing being grafted into an existing thing. So that's how, Gentiles become Christians. They're grafted in.
Right. But what they're grafting into is, when he's talking about that, he's talking about how is it that Jews can say, well, this is our religion, and Gentiles without becoming Jews. So Paul sees it as this tree as, okay, it's Judaism, and at some point it becomes Christianity, this tree. I mean, this is not, what's the word I'm looking for, gardening sound, okay? I am not the gardener in the family, by the way, in case anybody is, okay? She is a gardener wife. She is not the gardener's wife. Just make that, I think I put that in the Constitution too, did I? I should have made that clear. Okay, so, and then he goes on to say, was a man uncircumcised when he was called, he should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Okay, and that's, there, again, this is Corinth, he's talking to Corinth, which is a Gentile, predominantly Gentile area, although there is a Jewish community there, there's no question about that. Okay, but this may be Paul's, like, start down the path of recognizing that, hey, you know, being a Jew, being ethnically a Jew, or even religiously a Jew, is not a prerequisite to being a believer. That somebody, and that in and of itself would be outrageously controversial to a Jew. Okay, that, oh, wait a minute, you don't have to be. And this is one of the, you know, that's what the Judaizers and all of that stuff, when you get into some of the other apostles, some of the other epistles, that's part of the argument today. Hey, wait a minute, you know, you have to be a Jew first. And Paul's like, no, you don't. And I think here Paul is kind of introducing that idea, because to a Jew, to talk about being circumcised and being uncircumcised, I mean, it seems strange today that that's how you would identify your religion based on that, but they do. But I think they would understand right away. You know, the circumcised, you know, it's like, oh, Jews, non-Jews, kind of thing. And I think Paul is pointing out, no, it's, you know, if you're a Jew, stay a Jew. If you're not a Jew, you don't have to become a Jew to be a believer. Keeping God's command is what counts. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Okay, and again, Paul reminds, can't be literal. Let's go down to verse 21. This is a fun little discussion. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. It's easy for Paul to say, you know? So literally I put here, Paul then encourages slaves to relax. Do you remember I told you the story about my son telling me to calm down on a text, and I just about bit his head off? You know, I don't think he's ever told me to calm down since then. Even though he's 24 and probably bigger than me, he still doesn't tell me to calm down, kind of thing. And Paul is like telling me, hey, relax. Don't let it trouble you that you're a slave. You know, and there are people that will look at this and say that the Bible condones slavery. And you know, I think the Bible was written in an era when slavery was a common thing based on military conquests and things, and the slavery then that was practiced at this point in time, first century Rome, was not the slavery that was practiced in 19th century, 18th, 19th century America, or the world in the 18th and 19th century. There's a lot of similarities, don't get me wrong. But for one thing, I believe in the Roman times, you know, you would be a slave, but there was always, very often, it was very common, I should say, to have an understanding that at some point it was ending. That, you know, you would be a slave for a certain amount of times, a number of years, and then you would be free to go to move on, which was not a characteristic of the U.S. style of I don't know if that's the right word, of slavery here. But he says, if you can gain your freedom, if you can gain your freedom, do so. Okay, so again, if you're a slave, you know, don't think that because you're a believer, you no longer have to be a slave, or that you are free from the whatever the requirements, whatever the law says about you being a slave. But hey, if you can get out of it, great. Okay. He says, if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's free person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Okay? So basically, regardless of one's earthly status in this realm, becoming a believer does not free you from being a slave. Or, the word slave and servant it's the same Greek word, doulos. And so depending on the context is how they translate servant or slave. But Paul is saying, listen, just if you become a believer, that doesn't free you from being a slave. Okay? Because you are now a slave/servant of Christ. You're a slave/servant of God, kind of thing. So it was Bob Dylan had a song. You're going to serve someone, kind of thing. So, brothers and sisters, again, each person as responsible to God should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. And I think this may deal with what's going on in Corinth, and that is that people are using their Christian belief, their faith, to upset the social order in some way. That's just a speculation on my part. And he's going, no, you're causing more trouble than you're fixing. Okay, that's not the right way to live out your Christian faith, sort of thing. Okay. So brothers and sisters, each person as responsible to God should remain in the situation they were when God called them. Okay. So again, he's dealing with specific situations going on in Corinth. Okay, and you always have to remember that with any of the, I shouldn't say any, most of the epistles, that he's dealing with specific situations, and you have to, before you just leap onto it and go, okay, well, you have to remain in this situation. Well, yeah, this is not exactly what was happening in Corinth. So, that's a great principle, and it's applicable at that level, but it's not a command. Okay. So, moving on to, any questions? Moving on, verse 25. There are two, as we go through verses 25 through 40, the rest of the passage that we're going to talk about today, the big question, there's two big questions that you have to ask yourself. First of all, who are the virgins? Who or what are the virgins? And what is the present crisis? Okay? Who or what are the virgins, and what is the present crisis? And I say that because in verse 25, it says, verse 25, now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Okay? So first of all, who are the virgins in this passage? And I'm kind of skipping ahead, or kind of talking about, there's at least 4 ideas of who he's talking about. And it could be any one or perhaps all 4. Okay? The first one is it's what you think of. It's young, unmarried women. That's just, he's talking about young, unmarried women. Now, it could also, and this is kind of a very minority view, married women who have consented to live apart from their husbands. There are those, again, this is a minority view. There's a couple of scholars out there who said that this better fits the context of what's going on, that they have announced, hey, we are virgins, we're not married. Okay. A third idea is that they are young, engaged women deciding whether to go through with it. Okay. And then a fourth is, again, kind of a minority view, although it's an alternative translation, that they're talking about daughters. That this is instruction to fathers, talking about how to deal with their young unmarried daughters. Okay, it's similar to the first one, but it's the instruction is to the father. Okay, and again, thinking of the situation, they're thinking, okay, well, should I bother going through the process of marrying off my daughters? Which, again, don't have any daughters, so I never had to go through that process myself. I have seen Fiddler on the Roof several times, which is going to be at Drury Lane, I think, Drury Lane Theater. They're going to do a production of Fiddler on the Roof. I think in the spring. It's great. Has anybody seen Fiddler on the Roof live? It's great. Yeah, it's great fun. I've had fun with daughters. But who has never seen Fiddler on the Roof? So you have no idea what I'm talking about.
I do, I just haven't seen it.
Pardon?
I do, I just haven't seen it.
Okay, yeah. So it could be talking to daughters. So he says, now about these virgins, and I want to zero in on this next thing. I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Okay, so basically Paul, over the next 15 verses, is giving us his opinion. This is what Paul thinks. And he's telling you right off the bat. Okay, I'm not, what do you think about this, Paul? Like, well, don't really know what the Lord thinks about this. Don't really have a command from the Lord, or this situation doesn't really fit the thing, but here's what I think. Okay? Because of the present crisis, I think it is good for a man to remain as he is. Okay? So Paul makes it clear in verse 25 that he has given us his opinion. But if you go down to verse 40, in my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Okay, so Paul is saying, I think I'm right here. Okay, so Paul is pretty confident in his opinion. Okay, where is it? So the question then is, are 21st century believers bound by this? And this is one of the, again, we're already dealing with, and I hesitate looking at 1 Corinthians and applying anything too strictly, because it's like, okay, wait, you're dealing with a specific situation. But here, Paul is not acting, he's telling the readers, listen, I don't really know, I don't have a specific command here. This is my opinion, And so, to me, the answer, are 21st century's believers bound by this? No, I don't think so. Although there are people who would argue, well, yeah, yes.
What is the present crisis that he's?
We're going to get to that in just a second. So what is, the next thing, what is the present crisis? What is the present crisis that he's talking about? Now keep in mind, he's looking at a letter from the Corinthians. He's looking at a letter from the church, and they're talking about situations that are going on. Okay? So there's two basic ideas of what the present crisis is. Okay? The first one we mentioned earlier, and that is that Paul's idea that the end of the world is near. It's Paul's sense of the end times. That Christ's return is imminent. That there's no reason to do anything. Whenever I think about this, I think of how many of you have a very favorite, very stupid movie? You know what I'm thinking about? It's dumb. It's dumb.
It's Dumb and Dumber.
Well,
Eurovision. Eurovision.
I love Eurovision.
so
Yeah.
you know it's a dumb movie, but you love the movie. It's just something about the movie. One of mine, and actually, unfortunately, I have several. One of mine is a movie called Strange Brew. Has anybody seen Strange Brew? Yes. It's Bob and Doug McKenzie. What most people don't realize, Strange Brew is a Hamlet spinoff. Shakespeare's Hamlet. I'm not making this up. Have you seen it recently? No? Okay. The name of the beer company is Elsinore Brewery. Elsinore is where takes place, a lot of the castle where things take place. You've got a brother who's killed by an uncle. The uncle marries the thing. The daughter, the child is displaced. It's a Hamlet thing. It's like, and I watched the thing a couple of times in my much younger days, and then I watched it recently, within the last 2 years, was when I realized, wait a minute, this is Hamlet kind of thing. So there is, I'm using that as my excuse, but it's still a stupid movie. But there's one scene in this film where the two guys are in a beer truck. and they're going down a hill. Okay, it's a steep hill. They're in this truck full of beer, and they realize that the brakes have been cut on the truck. Okay, so the one guy, it's Bob and Doug McKenzie, you know, Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas? Dave Thomas. And so Dave Thomas is driving, and they realize that the brakes have been cut on the thing. And so Dave Thomas is driving, and he just takes his hands off the wheels, and he says, "Oh, there's no reason to steer anymore." Kind of thing. And so sometimes when I hear Paul saying that, you know, the end crisis, you know, the end crisis is right there, I think of Dave Thomas going, "Well, there's no reason to steer anymore," but then Rick Moranis goes, "Steer the," you know, kind of gets back to him. By the way, every business, you know, every third business meeting now, according to the Constitution, will be watching Stratford. I don't know if you know that. That was in that new revision that you may or may not have. You might not have read that part. But be that as it may. So the present crisis is just Paul's idea of the end times. Okay.
Why would he call it a crisis? I thought we're looking forward to the end, you know, for Christ's return.
Well, the idea of trying to accomplish as much for the kingdom as you can before Christ's return. But I mean, that's a good point, and that would lead to the second idea of the present crisis is, and unfortunately this is not a very specific answer, but it's a crisis specific in Corinth. Whatever's going on in Corinth. Whatever the situation is that caused the church of Corinth to write a letter. And unfortunately, we don't know what that is. The Corinthians do. Paul does, because he's looking at the letter. And we can only speculate, and obviously we've done a lot of that. Say, this is what I think is going on there. But Paul says, because of this present crisis, so there's something there that Paul said, listen, because of what's going on in Corinth, and I lean toward the latter, the idea, you know, because Paul may have thought that the end of all things was near, but that didn't stop him from planning missionary trips and thinking he needed to get the gospel to Rome and all of that, you know, so he wasn't exactly taking his hands off the wheel and going, oh, there's no reason to drive now, kind of thing. So, I think it's whatever was going on. And Paul's like, look, you know, based on this present crisis, just, you know, just don't get into these marriages that you're not going to want to be in or something like that. But he says, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Okay? So Paul presents a series of scenarios based on this present crisis and his advice. And to me, I think that's what this is. This is Paul's advice. Okay? Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if the virgin marries, she has not sinned. Okay, so are you engaged? Don't break the engagement. Are you not engaged? Good. That's what the G is. Good. Just stay as you are. Okay? If you do get married, don't worry, it's not a sin. Okay? And the last thing, and this is like my favorite verse in this passage. Sorry. And the next time I do a wedding, this is going to be my text.
Yeah, right.
Okay? Those who marry will face many troubles in this life. And I want you to spare you this. That's going to be have anyone ever been to a wedding where that was the wedding text? See? Wouldn't that be great? Maybe what I'm going to do, hey, I got you. This is great. This should have been in the Constitution. I'm gonna get a set of like those coffee mugs where you can get things imprinted on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and I'm gonna get like just a box of those, and it's gonna have that verse on it. But I
For
warn you,
wedding.
and that's gonna be my wedding shower gift. Here you go, a couple, a pair of them. I'm just kidding. Don't anybody go out and buy it. I made a joke once about that, and somebody went out and, it's something. In Jeremiah 29 is the verse about, I know the plans I have for you, all of that. And we were joking about the fact that you see that on coffee cups, but you don't see the other verses in Jeremiah 29, including the one where it says, I'm going to destroy you and crush you. So why doesn't anybody ever put that on a coffee cup? Well, somebody did. And gave it to me, and I have it. It's great. It's a great. It's a real conversation starter. You know, especially when you go to the to the Bible study, you're pulling with that coffee right there. You know. So yeah, but be that as it may, that's those coffee cups are not in the Constitution. They will be in phase 2. I'm just saying. But what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as they do not, those who mourn as if they do not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them, for this world in its present form is passing away. Now, this is an interesting passage here. Okay, and I think what Paul is getting at here is to just change your perspective. Okay, this is not a command for us to say, okay, those who mourn as if they did not. Okay, are you sad about something? Well, just stop it. Has anybody seen the video? There's a video of Bob Newhart. It might be like a Saturday Night Live sketch, where Bob Newhart plays a therapist, and the person comes in for therapy, and the woman sits down, and he says, all right, I'm going to fix your problem with 3 words. And it's going to cost you $5. And he says, she says, well, do you want to hear he's like, okay, go ahead. And so she gives the whole spiel. Does anybody know, has anybody seen this? So, okay, so you have to Google this. This is your assignment. Bob Newhart, just stop it. That's his advice. She gives this whole spiel, and he goes, okay, 3 words, just stop it. This is a funny video to us because our son is a social worker and does a lot of counseling. And so we keep telling him, just tell him to stop it. This doesn't go over well, kind of thing. So is Paul literally saying, listen, are you mourning somebody? Stop it. Okay? If you have a wife, live like you don't have a wife. Okay? Marty, how well is that going to go over for you?
Not too well.
Yeah.
You're not gonna start dating other women,
Yeah.
right?
Are we taking that? That's not in the Constitution. I just want to point that out. Okay? So, Paul is looking at your perspective on life and say, okay, change your perspective, but this is getting into Paul's idea of the end of the world. He says, for the world in its present form is passing away. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affair, and he's looking at this from his perspective. Paul believes, and we've seen this in previous passages, that because of his single status, he is able to focus on the things of the Lord, okay? Which is good. I don't know that you can categorically say that all single men are focused on things of the Lord, okay? Probably very few, okay? Very few married men, too, so it isn't something about, this is where I insert the joke, married men are focused on the things of the Lord because they're constantly saying things like, Lord, help me.
Oh, Ricardo, you laughed too hard. I like that.
I'm going to edit that part out, so that's not going to come back to haunt me. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. Okay, so when we go down here, Paul presents a series of scenarios, etc. Are you engaged? Don't break the engagement. Are you not engaged? Good. If you do get married, don't worry, it's not a sin. In the present crisis, those who marry will face many troubles. Paul's concern is because the time is short. Paul asks us to shift our perspective. To Paul, an unmarried person is concerned about the things of the Lord. Married people, to Paul, are concerned about the things/needs of their spouse. And then down there, I put in the little brackets, for the record, this is a good thing. I'm trying to reclaim my thing here. So again, an unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the body in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. And again, notice the mutuality here. The husband, a married man, how he can please his wife. Married woman, how she can please her husband. Okay, so there's a mutuality here between, as far as married roles, gender roles in marriage. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord, again, in light of the present crisis, either what's going on in Corinth or Paul's sense of eschatology, or both. They could be combined. It could be a sense of, you know, if anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably before the virgin, and verses 36 and following is really where people look at this and say he's actually talking to parents at this point. Okay, verse 36, if anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He's not sinning, they should get married. So it's interesting that Paul is not being dogmatic about his opinion. Okay? Paul's like, I don't think you guys should get married because of the end times, because of what's going on. But hey, you know, if you really want to, go ahead. Yeah. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man does the right thing. So then he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her is better. And again, this is Paul's opinion. Okay, in Paul's opinion, it would be better to be not married because then you can be undivided attention to things of the Lord. But he's not, you know, this is basically the, you know, Thanksgiving is coming up, and you have the old curmudgeonly uncle, which is a role that I'm really trying to take in my family. I really want to create that role in my family. You know, go ask Uncle Stan, see what he says. You know, and he'll say some wacky thing, kind of thing. Paul is just saying, this is what I think.
I'm going for crazy aunt.
Pardon me?
I'm going for crazy
Going
aunt.
for crazy aunt and uncle, I've decided that the rich uncle thing isn't working out. That was my goal originally, but that's not working out. So I have to go for the crazy uncle kind of thing. So then he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. And I think the one thing to really take away from this passage is just look at, Paul is not being very dogmatic here. I mean, Paul gets a bad rap a lot of times, and for good reason sometimes, about being very, like, oh, well, Paul says it. Paul, that's Paul. Can't we just do what Jesus says? Why do we have to worry about what Paul said? But I think, Paul is like, hey, this is my opinion, this is what I think. And there's good reason for it, but, if you want to go the other way, go ahead. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. Well, let me make sure here. Paul's concerned in light of his eschatology that people live in undivided devotion, and I should have put in there, to the Lord. Verses 36 and following have a couple of different translation possibilities, especially husband, wife, or father, daughter. So it could be talking to parents. Because you can understand that if there's a question about being married, whether or not a person should get married, and you are the father of daughters, then this is something that would apply to you. You think, okay, because the father, the parents, were largely responsible for creating the marriage opportunities, let's put it that way. For setting up, they had to go talk to the other dads and go, hey, I got a daughter, you got a son, let's make a deal, kind of thing. I assume that's how it went. Again, no daughters, so, women, it says women are bound, women are bound to their husband, verse 39. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. But he must belong to the Lord. Okay? So women are bound to their husband, verse 39. Do husbands face the same constraints? Yes, no, maybe. Well, I think yes. I mean, clearly earlier Paul said a husband must not divorce his wife. Okay? And being a believer is not. So here, again, the issue, I think, on the table, or the issue in the letter, has to do with women being married, and he's focusing on that. But Paul is answering the specific questions. But just because he says a woman is bound, you can't look at this and say, well, Paul doesn't say that a man is bound. A couple of problems with that sort of interpretation, or that sort of a hermeneutic. One is that you're arguing from silence, which is done way more often than it should be. Well, the Bible never says. Okay, well, Bible doesn't say you shouldn't eat a lawnmower either, but that doesn't make it a good idea. Okay, that's not original one. It's be that as it may. So what's interesting here is that Paul throws in at the end that any marriage should be between believers. And it wouldn't make much sense to say, listen, I'm going to leave this marriage with this non-believer and go out and marry another one. But he must belong to the Lord. Again, you're free to get married, but marry within the faith. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is. Now that's Paul's opinion. Okay? And I think it's fair to say that you can sit here and look at this and say, you know what? Paul may be wrong here. Okay? Because it's one thing for, for an old, and I think Paul is widowed, but for an old single guy to say, you know what I think makes women happy? This. It's like, no. He's not standing on very strong ground here, let's put it that way. But he says, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Paul's saying, I think I'm right. I don't think he is. Okay, but, and I think we can do that, and I think we can look at that, and we can look at this passage, and the interesting thing about this passage is, when we look at the Bible, we look at the text, we say, well, the Bible is God-breathed. The Bible is inspired, and so therefore, we have to do what it says, right? What does it mean if the Bible's not inerrant? Okay, that we have to, can we pick and choose what to believe or not? Well, yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, when Paul says this is my opinion, then that's it, Paul's opinion. You've got an opinion there. So if your 17-year-old daughter says, I want to get married, or a 27-year-old daughter, whatever, says, well, you know what Paul says? Paul says it's better for you to not be married. See how far that gets you. I don't know, do you have any daughters? Do you have any daughters? 3? Did you ever have this conversation where you say, Paul says you shouldn't get married?
No.
Kind of thing. Yours are not a marriageable age.
She's 6.
6.
Little young, yeah.
Yeah.
She'll never get married.
Start now. Just 1 Corinthians 7 kind of thing. But I think we really need to, and again, this is part of the point of looking at the whole idea of what Paul is saying. This is Paul's opinion, dealing with this present crisis in Corinth. Paul says, well, this might fix the problem, but I don't think it's something that we need to sit down, and that's, to me, that's the big lesson here. It's like we can look at this text, we could say, okay, these are good suggestions coming from somebody who really cares, but they're not necessarily good ideas. And I think we can say that without violating any sanctity of Scripture or inerrancy or any of that kind of stuff, which may in other universes get me kicked out of the church, but it can't happen now because in the new Constitution I can't get kicked out of the church. So y'all can, not me. See, everybody is subject to being kicked out except Stan. It's in there. You guys maybe you didn't see it, kind of thing. So next week we're going to get into another fun topic. Not the women keeping silent in the church. Not yet. That one's coming. You guys still have a few more weeks to talk. You laugh, right?
Wait till that class, right?
Yeah.
Debbie's been holding secret meetings.
Yeah. I'll announce that, and then
Our
all of a
torches
sudden,
and our pitchforks ready.
yeah, there'll be 50 women in the class. Go ahead, Stan. We're ready. Let us hear what you have to say.
One way.
That's right. Stan's going to talk about how
Pretty
women.
standard effort, he said that.
Yeah. Well, you can't do that. It's in the Constitution.
There's 5 of us, there's only 4 of you.
But next week we're going to talk about food sacrificed to idols, which is another concept that gets bantered around quite a bit. Has anybody heard some argument about the food sacrificed to idols, and therefore, we can't go to? When I was growing up, you couldn't go to Hollywood movies. I was talking to my son today. It's like when I was a kid, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, you didn't go to Hollywood movies because food sacrificed to idols. You can't. Kind of stuff. We'll talk about that next week. So, any questions? Anything else? All right, thank you very much, and I'll see you all next week. Hey, Rob, you're the guy.
It's like it's not digital or anything.
Nest, right?
Yeah, get a nest.